So with me today, I've got Viper, and I'm going to ask him about his past career, his past endeavors, and then what he thinks of Illuvium PvP, and basically how he's approaching the game, whether it be team building or strategy in game. We're going to cover it all because this is a real life Hearthstone pro, and we don't get many opportunities to talk to someone like that that really understands the competitive mindset and the mindset of their opponent in the ways that you can when playing a TCG. So Viper, can you briefly tell me about your Hearthstone career and any other professional endeavors you've had?
Yeah, surely. So I think when you say professional, people often use that nowadays a bit like vaguely because for Hearthstone certainly I made like about a little more than $250,000 prize money, played for multiple years in top esport leagues in the world, and a bunch of sponsorship contracts, things like that. So that was like genuinely my way of making a living for multiple years. Then I don't know, just other games where I didn't make a good living with, but I was good at like multiple TCGs, mainly Yu-Gi-Oh. Got Challenger, got high ranks in Challenger easily whenever I played TFT. I think I peaked rank 5 in the first set before just going back to Hearthstone. It was like a 1 month break and I could just play TFT for fun back then. I was hoping that TFT would pop off more, but it didn't in the early sets. Like it's kind of now, but it's still, I don't know, it's still worse than what Hearthstone used to be back then, but Hearthstone also used to be like third biggest game on Twitch and everything, like good times back then.
I remember watching Hearthstone streams. I'm not a big person that watches a lot of streams, but Hearthstone is the one thing that I did kind of get into because I just really enjoyed the game. So, do you see any similarities between Illuvium and Hearthstone that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, the main similarity that I see in Illuvium and pretty much deck building card games is that, well, Illuvium is a deck building game. Now we call it team. Okay, it probably makes sense. It's not cards that we put on a board, right? But that's the main fundamental similar thing. And also so far from, okay, playing this like early version with not even all the Illuviates in and probably a bunch of changes to be made, maybe even fundamental mechanics like how much damage you take per round, how much health you have, right? All of that impacts what is like good and bad in the game, because can you win? Right now you can win on round 4, later you can win on round 5, and so on. But all of this comes into this fact of like team building, deck building. What can you do? What are you allowed to do? Like right now, you're not allowed to build a team with all composites. Like somebody is just gonna run you over with some early game things because they're just gonna win rounds 1 to 3 very convincingly, and they'll probably take a round away from you with some positioning. Like I've mentioned in the past, the Illuvium is not. There's some 50-50s in the game, basically. There's like, it's the rogue on this side, it's the rogue on the other side. And if your team is not built enough for the earlier rounds, you're at 1 life, then you lose the 50-50 one time. So maybe you're even favored and it's like a 2 out of 3 or 4 out of 3 to win in your favor percentage-wise. Or if the other guy gets more shots at hitting them, then they'll probably still be favored in the end. So right now, it's very similar to the card games where you can't just sacrifice the entire early game and just play like all 10 mana things in your team, right? So very similar in that regard. I think competitive format's gonna be obviously not one best of one. I hope we will have some more extra rules in those, where like Hearthstone used to play Conquest and Last Hero Standing most of the time, which made the deck building and team building aspect for competitive super interesting, because on ladder, well, you play versus a blind random opponent, and you probably have to be okay-ish versus everything, or at least very good versus most of it if you're very bad versus some parts of it. So you accomplish, I don't know, like a 58 to 60% average win rate is realistically what you could get as like in top 100 playing with other people that are good at the game. So Illuvium competitive, I believe, is going to take the same route, where we make formats where it's like, okay, you have to have 3 teams, maybe no same Illuviates or augments in them, and you have to get a win with each of them in the best of 3, best of 5 series. You get a ban, or maybe your teams are out once they lose, and the other guy can sweep you with one team, something like that. But where I don't know, you have to put more thought into the different teams, and it's going to be tremendously different from the best of 1 on the ladder, essentially. That's where I believe most of the competitive things come in. And if somebody right now would be criticizing, like, yo, this is like, I play my Earth team and I play with the Water team, I lose. It's like, yeah, okay, that's the thing on probably why playing full Earth has downsides, the same with Fire and so on. And we have to figure that out. That's a really long answer, but that's the really difficult part right now. I think also for me in the last few days, where it was like, okay, what's somewhat of a balance between playing the early game with strong early game and then not falling into this trap of just having 5 or 7 of one affinity and being potentially losing to the hyper thing, and playing more around composites that maybe then can get hyper themselves and so on. So there's a lot of depth in the team building in Illuvium, and playing it, I realized it's very different to in card games, because in card games you have card draw RNG. You don't have your entire deck in your hand all the time. So somebody can like have the way better deck than you in a card game, but they just draw poorly and you beat them. Somebody can have really strong counters against you, they just don't draw them, you beat them, and things like that. So you get, on one hand, you get not punished a lot for putting some like bad tech decisions into your team, because you just don't need to play all your cards in an Illuvium battle every time. On the other hand, you also have everything available to you, so there's like a lot less of this variance based on that, which means that your team building matters probably more than a card game, because in a card game you can just play like 5 or 10 bad cards and maybe you never draw them, so it didn't actually matter in the match. Illuvium, you play 5 bad augments, 5 bad Illuvias, it really makes a difference.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I have noticed is having your whole deck available to you. It makes it kind of unlike any other game that exists, at least in the strategy genre. And it's interesting. It's interesting to say the least. So the next one I'll ask is, how do you plan out your team when you were building it? Like, do you start? I've started myself starting from the end, being what do I want my 8 team to look like, and then working backwards. How do you go about it?
I've so far done more or less the opposite, I think. I've been thinking about, okay, I have 100 points the first round. How can I spend 100 points really efficiently? How can I spend then the next 100 points, the next 120 points? And I usually try to have at least a plan for the first 3 rounds without maybe moving or taking Luviets back or anything, because, well, taking Luviets back and moving, I don't think it's very expensive, but I think it's very expensive in the first few rounds because you just have so little mastery points available to you. So I try to just maximize the power level there, and instead of having to move to play around rogues or enemy positioning, I can place new things to counteract that, basically. So it's like, well, yeah, in some end, I think about, okay, what's like the end of my team? Like, okay, if I play towards Arcanite, I'm not going to put the Arcanite in Luvia round 1, but I'm going to think, okay, I'm going to probably put the Arcanite in Luvia round 3 or 4, and how do I get to round 3 or 4, not being at almost no life points left, being maybe killing some enemy Illuvians and so on. So that's mainly been the approach, just like try to figure out the early rounds and how to get there, and then how to put the other things in. On the other side, it's also trying to figure out where to get. So if we want to get to a Scoriox or Invoker or something, it's like, okay, you have to play some frontline. So you just have to figure out, okay, what's like the frontline to put in. I think the current cases would be like a cheap Bulwark or maybe a cheap like Empath Clump kind of thing that are really, really good frontlines. So you can then play 1 Phosphorus or 1 Arcanite plus a Ranger. That's a very cheap bonding option. Or maybe you can play Shock or Invoker or. But the more we talk about these things, it's like, okay, the Arcanite thing, that's like 1 unit. Ramfire is 1 unit. Arcanite could be 2 units. And then Invoker is even more Illuvius and so on. So at that point, we get to, okay, you have to survive even longer, play even more late game. And then the goal is kind of like realizing, okay, you're probably not going to have a good first few rounds, because that's just not what those Illuvians are capable of, especially Invoker. It's like the best late game thing in theory, but getting there is difficult. So you have to be really stable on round 4. That's usually what I go for if my goal is to win late on. Really, really stable on round 4, very, very strong team. And round 4 onwards, I'm able to add really, really strong augments to my team every turn, basically. That's kind of how I approach that. I usually don't play too many Illuviates as well, kind of for that aspect as well, because I just play my first turns. I play from 1 hyper carry, maybe 2 or 3 hyper carry versions, and then I have, I don't know, like 15 augments or something, and just start decking out the team with the augments, covering the situations where the Illuviates might not be super strong.
I like that. What's one of those situations, like the energy reducing thing and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's this enemy team energy reduce thing, right? That can be really good against some Ramfire or Invoker team comms. Then the I don't know, AoE grit and resolve buffs are really good against rogues because they just do like auto attack damage. They don't have really big hitting abilities oftentimes, or in general just like being tankier versus sorry. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, any enemy has like frontline high damage output. You just put some invulnerability or indomitable augment on some really weak frontline Illuvi if you play for like the Atipo frontline. If you play for some actual frontline tanks, then just adding more resistance to them straight up. Or like the obvious one, just adding more damage to your Illuviates. Then when adding more damage to the Illuviates, there are two options. There's like you can play upfront damage, something like just straight up attack speed and attack damage buff, or you can play more for the scaling damage option, which if the other guy is also playing a like front to back line fight and the fight takes 40-50 seconds, playing for plus crit chance, like the plus 60 crit chance augment, and you gain energy attack damage or physical attack damage respectively on your Illuvia, that's the best scaling damage thing that you can put on any ranged, especially carry in the game. And yeah, if you're playing really slow fights, or if you're playing for one hyper carry damage alluvial with super tanky frontline, I think that's usually the way to go there, and that's how I would just like approach beating my opponent's strategy with augments. Like oftentimes it's more about how to beat their strategy than how to like get hyper or something like that. Like you want to cover rogues to some extent, you want to cover super high tank and healing to some extent, and well, yeah, you also want to probably have some rogues yourself, at least right now, because the two synergy is just so powerful. I'm not a big fan of it being a two synergy. I think it's too good, but well, we'll see about that.
So, how often? I know you talked about you don't always sell or move alluvials, especially in the first 3 rounds. But how often do you sell or move alluvials around later on in the game?
For most of the teams I've been playing, most of the selling Illuviates has been when I just switched like 25 cost Illuviates to big composite ones, like stage 3 Illuviates later on. That's like one of the main things. Is probably like a round 5 thing, honestly, because, well, they're like definitely good enough to be in play until round 3 or 4, and just putting augments on the important Illuviates that I put in on round 3 and 4 again is usually better. So then, like on round 5, 6, at some point, it's like, okay, it's not that valuable to put a bunch of augments on 25 cost Illuviates. I think that's the tremendous upside on higher tier, higher stage Illuviates right now, that they just scale a lot better with augments. If the Illuvia has 2000 health, then getting more resistance on it is a lot better than if the Illuvia has 1200 health, like a Grokko, for example. And the same thing with the damage output and so on. Even though on the damage output side, I guess in theory, something like a Fire Doka is one of the higher DPS Illuviates in the game, even though it costs 25 mastery points. So giving it a bunch of damage buffs would be good. But on the other hand, it's like it's just going to die to some AoE things and so on later on. And the DPS on paper looks really good, but, well, if it's only like on free fire and free fighter composite like Arcanite, it's just going to outperform it. So that's why putting on augments on composite Illuviates oftentimes is just going to end up being stronger in the like round 5 plus later stages, especially. And yeah, that's kind of how I approach that. And sometimes I currently haven't been playing a bunch of teams where I would be like, okay, my opponent played committed to this other element, I'm going to sell everything and put in this other thing, because I feel like it takes so many slots from your team away for other things that it's very difficult to cover different strategies with augments, and you just cover like one element extra at most. So I'm not sure if that's like the winning strategy, unless, because if you face that element all the time, then, well, why even play the element that's weak to it? And if you play it a few times, then maybe the augments for the, I don't know, 80% other things that are helping you in those matchups would be better kind of perspective. So on the other hand, moving is super valuable, as we've learned from survival especially, and just having better positioning is really it's just incredibly strong, right? Just focus firing down some Illuvia before it gets Omega ability off, having your rogues jump to the right side and things like that. Just incredibly strong. And the difficult part, and especially your rogues thing, is like, okay, is my opponent also gonna move? So that's probably gonna come down to, well, if you both have to move all the time, you have less mastery points available each round. Which player is that benefiting, basically? And then you can kind of figure out, okay, for which player is it actually a 50-50, or for which player is it just like, well, if I move and they don't move, that's good. If I move and they move, it's also good for me, maybe. And that scenario could happen a lot, especially when like the rogue and the Illuvium are not on the same side. And you can move your rogue into it. Yes, you lost some power level, but your rogue is now attacking the Illuvium. If the other person played around it, they have put one less augment into play because they had to move again. And if they have -1 augment, that's maybe also just like a good trade-off for you. So we're gonna see scenarios like that. That is also very similar with how legendary augment bidding works so far, I think, where if your team can utilize more of the augments than the enemy team can, then it's very difficult for the enemy to bet into it. Because it's like, well, they can bet on the thing that's really good for you, but it's going to be useless for them. So if you decide to not bet on that, you deny all the good ones and you get one of the good ones, the other ones for yourself. And they just are left with a useless one that they just put one coin into and something like that. So it certainly is very beneficial to have teams that make use of more of the legendary augments, like the same strategy behind it, basically.
A lot of the legendary augments really benefit Scoriox. Like there's very few in there that don't benefit magma or attack speed in general. And so I've found that I've had a lot of options, whereas my opposing empaths or whatever have very few compared to me, and that can give me a pretty solid edge. So the last question I've got for you today is, and you don't have to give away any of your decks that you've made or anything like that, but what's your favorite team archetype so far?
Ooh. No, I think like anything with phosphorus at this point. Like I really like Scoriox as an Illuvia, so whenever somebody asks me, I do say Scoriox is my favorite Illuvia from like watching the trailer and so on, because like in any kind of game or whatever, I usually like this artillery sniper kind of theme in anything. So I like Scoriox a lot, and I like Phosphorus a lot, and well, they both happen to be Arcanite essentially. So I think most of the teams I've been playing were playing around both of those two as well, and I've liked playing those two. I've more towards the Phosphorus side just because I'm Ramfire and people were playing so many rogues all the time, so that Scoriox didn't feel too great into that. It's kind of made me grow more attached towards the Terror Bird, and just essentially playing that. I think overall Arcanite is my favorite trait. It could be Invoker, but it just like feels too bad to play at the moment. So definitely just preferring Arcanite. Also, just I don't know, the big bird like lifesteal, drain tank, and Scoriox's artillery thing just feels really cool to watch.
It is a lot of fun when you're watching Phosphorus like fire off the beak every like half a second for whatever reason, and just like absolutely dominating. It is a lot of fun to watch for sure. So that's all I've got for today. Thanks so much for joining me and talking about your experience, talking about how you're approaching PvP. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us off on before I stop recording?
I don't know. I'm really happy to be here. Essentially, I'm always happy to talk about all those topics and talk about games, help people just get a little better at doing what they enjoy doing. Maybe just like this whole process of like, because I think games are really great. It's generally a very merit-based and fair thing to do in the competitive environment to engage on. Everybody can just get better. It's actually just no, it's just a fair merit-based contest, and I really love to see when people try to better themselves. And most of it is about mindset. So I think it's like a really healthy thing to engage in the end, and that's why I like to keep engaging in it, and I like to keep playing games and make content and talk about it.